California was as independent of the Mexican central government as Taiwan is from China today. Okay, we'd achieved that. We did that. And we were the ones that defended California, not the Mexican central government. So here it was not a Mexican-U.S. war. It was a California-U.S. war, okay, which resulted in a ceasefire, which became a recognized armistice, like what ended the Korean War.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. My name is Darren Brown. You're listening to the California Dream podcast. And today, as promised, we have an interview. I promised more interviews in 2022, and today I make good on that promise with our first official guest of the new year, and that is Matt Owen. So Matt is someone who has been active in the movement since 2016. He's a very smart guy, very knowledgeable about California history and California politics. I sat down and talked to him recently, and we discussed a lot of different topics. This interview will be broken up into two parts. In the first part, I talked to Matt about the history of California, going all the way back to the original indigenous populations and the Spanish colonial period of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And in the second part, we discuss more contemporary issues facing California and where our future lies. So if you enjoy the interview, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast platform, you can give a rating. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. It really does make a difference in getting through the algorithms and getting the word out. So I am joined now by California native, a longtime activist in California independence movement. I'd like to welcome Matt Owen. How are you doing today, Matt?
Oh, not horribly.
So can you tell us a little bit about your personal background, how you became involved in the movement, what led you to these kind of ideas and activism?
Well, okay. My activism goes back to my student days, studying poli-sci and getting involved in the stuff I was studying at UC Riverside back in the 80s. And I've been an activist ever since. I've been involved with the California independence movement since its 21st century reincarnation in 2016 because of something awful that happened. Okay, that's what ballooned it from a few people, which didn't include me at the time, that thought, hey, this might be a nifty idea, to 1 out of every 3 Californians where it is. And that's just counting in Alta. That's not counting Baja, where they got a majority, but more on that later.
So why don't we start with something that I wasn't aware of until I started talking to a lot of different people. And that is in the media and the mainstream, when they talk about this kind of things with different movements in the country, they frame it using the word secession. And really, a lot of us don't look at it that way. We try to stay away from that word a bit because of the history of California. So can you explain a little bit why we don't really consider the independence movement as pushing for secession per se? What's the distinction there? The distinction between secession and independence, and what are the historical roots for that distinction?
Well, first of all, we were a separate Spanish colony. Cortez crossed the Sea of Cortez and colonized California south to north. Okay. The peninsula first. And then when he found out that it wasn't an island, it was a peninsula, he kept going north as far as he could until he run into other colonizers heading south. Okay. The Americans, the Canadians, the Russians were in the south. He was heading north. And so a string of missions was established to establish Spaniard rule in the Californias. They would go out, they would literally grab indigenous people and force them to work as serfs on these farms, okay, surrounding the mission. And then they opened a few trade missions, and over a period of hundreds of years, you began to have the mixed people of California, the Californios, alongside the indigenous peoples. That's up until Mexican independence. Mexican independence, when California was considered a Mexican territory, was very tumultuous for us. We had all kinds of revolutions and counter-revolutions and so on and so forth, as did the Mexican mainland. But 1835 rolls around, and Lopez de Santa Anna decides to abolish all the Mexican states. Okay. We had been pushing for statehood. Originally, there was one window of our independence from the Mexican Confederation right after the emperor was overthrown. And that was when they allowed Central America to become independent. But the Mexican central government never offered that to us. And then they had the temerity to smash statehood and subject, the entirety of the Mexican nation to direct rule. And there were revolts that broke out all over the place. The Texians, us, there was one, I think, in Yucatan, and several other states revolted against the loss of their statehood. We revolted against the loss to achieve it, our own autonomy. So we took it. Okay. We had a legislature, the Diputación, which overthrew the imposed governor twice. And twice we seated our own governor, which the Mexican central government was forced to recognize, at pain of us becoming totally independent. So they did recognize Juan Bautista Alvarado, and they did recognize Pio Pico as governors we came up with. Okay, so twice the Mexican government recognized our right to govern ourselves. Then comes the Bear Flag Revolt by the folks who were in fact wanting to end our independence and have us annexed by the United States. That's why I don't use the bear flag, by the way. One of many reasons. But then Sutter joined them in his New Helvetia revolt, and then U.S. forces began to converge. You had John C. Fremont return from Oregon and head south. You had Commodore Sloat land 5,000 Marines in the capital of Monterey, forcing its government to flee. You had a guy by the name of Kearny came all the way over from the east. And since Sloat had already captured Monterey, he went to LA and was defeated. We thrashed him in the Battle of San Pasqual. And then they turned around and defeated us at the Battle of Cahuenga Pass. And we, one of our people, one of our Californias, she asked for a ceasefire between the combating forces, and they agreed to it. Fremont's forces and those under the command of Andres Pico from LA, they actually concluded a ceasefire. And then they brought it back to the California Diputación, who affirmed it. And then it was brought back to the US and Mexican governments, who also affirmed that as a binding armistice. So we didn't have the US-Mexican War here in California. We had a California-US war. And we basically came to a recognized armistice between the Californios and the US Army, right? So then the generalized US-Mexican War ends up with the defeat of the Mexican forces. And they signed something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. in which basically it was a forced sale of the entire northern half of Mexico to the U.S. for, X amount of gold bullion or whatever. Well, here's the thing. They had already recognized 3 separate occasions, 2 by the Mexican government and once by the U.S. government. They had recognized our right to govern ourselves. And then they turn around and sign this treaty. It's null and void in California. We had already 3 separate occasions. Our right to govern ourselves had been recognized. And they threw that out the window. So what a brilliant attorney by the name of Hana Miyamoto came up with is this. We don't have to secede from the U.S. We were never part of it. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is null and void on the territory of California. And there's a certain legal petition called a nunc pro tunc petition, which can demand of the court that they reverse reversible error. Think of Brown versus Board of Education reversing Plessy versus Ferguson on segregation. You get the picture. And so that's the idea. We wouldn't have to secede. All we need to do is show that the inclusion of Alta California in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo wasn't in fact an error, and that treaty should be vacated on the territory of Alta California, which by default returns us to our sovereignty, returns our sovereignty to us. That's what we're looking at. We don't have to secede. We were never part of the U.S.
Let me see if I can put this into kind of ordinary concrete terms and see if this is an accurate analogy or reflection of it. It's almost as if I have a dispute with somebody else over we have some debts or we have to settle something. And as part of the agreement, I say, I'm going to give you my neighbor's house.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yep.
Well, that doesn't make any sense. I can't make an agreement with you saying that I'm going to, as part of the agreement to settle the debt, I'm going to give you something that doesn't even belong to me. That just doesn't make sense. Is that an accurate?
That's exactly what happened. We were a separate Spanish colony. The Mexican government didn't grant us independence, yet they granted Central America independence. And then when they barred the way to us becoming a Mexican state, an autonomous Mexican state, by throwing those things out, that's when we said, no, you got 2 choices. Either you recognize our autonomy or we're going for full independence. And in fact, the Diputación, they elected 2 chief executives. They elected Juan Bautista Alvarado as our territorial governor to go to Mexico City and demand recognition. If he came back empty-handed, they also elected Jose Castro as president of the independent republic. So we had a plan B from the get, and we let Santa Ana know, if you don't sign this today, okay, we will be independent tomorrow. So he was forced to recognize, and then he sent somebody else by the name of Mitchell Terena. We, politely received him and his credentials. And when he screwed up, we threw him out, and we held an election that the Angelino Pia Pico won. Okay, so twice we forced them to recognize our autonomy. And when we fought the Americans, we forced them to recognize it was us they were fighting. They weren't fighting the Mexican army. The Mexican army wasn't here. They fought us. We fought them to a standstill. We defeated them the first time. They defeated us the second time. And we says, let's not fight anymore. Okay, just like with the Mexican government, will allow you here, but we will continue to govern ourselves. So yeah, definitely. We were a neighbor's house. We were a sister former Spanish colony to the Mexican mainland. Right? So yeah, they sold their neighbor's house. Oops.
So the legal argument would be that we didn't really voluntarily enter the Union. We were annexed.
Yeah, we were annexed. Exactly. Contrast that with the Texan Revolt. That was a bunch of U.S. immigrants who overthrew Mexican sovereignty over Texas because they wanted their slaves. And the Mexican government under Vicente Guerrero, its second president, had outlawed slavery. They also outlawed the holding of indigenous people to serfdom, to service at the missions. Okay. So Vicente Guerrero, he's like Hugo Chavez, he's half indigenous and half African. And he just immediately abolished slavery, abolished serfdom, took Mexico, 10 steps forward. Unfortunately, Santa Anna wasn't like that. He wouldn't like that at all. That's why he knew he would run into resistance from the state governments. So he abolished them.
And there's no statute of limitations on these kind of issues. If people say, well, that was 200 years ago, it doesn't matter how long ago it was.
No, it does not. I mean, as far as the legal argument goes, if I sell my neighbor's house and then that then the person that sold it sells it to somebody else, etc. It's still their house. It's like our indigenous land.
Exactly.
It is exactly like. In fact, it is indigenous land. And the ironic thing was that during the period, the so-called Mexican period, the Mexican government itself opened the door to returning indigenous land. Okay, by secularizing the missions, taking them away from the church. They were allowed their church itself, but the farmlands surrounding it were secularized by the Mexican government. And there was a very strong movement to return the mission lands to those from whom they had been stolen. Okay, the partisans of that in 1835, one of the partisans was the then governor, a guy by the name of Figueroa, who wrote the first book published in California. Okay, the very first book published here was a response to a couple of people that came with some papers that said, we want some of that land. And he goes, sure, as soon as we get through doing what we said we would do and returning a bunch of it to those from whom it had been stolen, then we'll look at your papers. And so he wrote a book about that exchange between him and the people that were trying to claim the land for themselves. First book published in California. He, for his part, fought to return the land, and he died in 1835. Right? The people that had worked with him were the same who declared independence in 1836. So it's always, our independence movement has always been bound up with the movement of our indigenous people to reclaim their land and sovereignty. Always. We have the same root.
Can you talk a little bit about the flag? This is another thing that I had no idea before I started talking with people. The bear flag versus the red star flag, and why a lot of us use the red star flag. First of all, what is it? What are its origins? And why do we use it like you and I use it versus other aspects of the current California flag?
Well, okay. When they gathered their forces and needed a flag to march under, to march on Monterey, the liberating forces, which were quite diverse. Okay, they included Californios, they included some U.S. settlers, they included a column from the Suisun Nation, who had worked very closely with the folks in Monterey. So it was a quite diverse column that showed up in Monterey demanding recognition of the legislature, the Diputación, as a national Congress of California. Of course, they said no such thing. And so there was a brief, very brief siege. The liberators brought up their only cannon with their only cannonball, shot it at these folks, and bam, hit the target. And he says, oh, that's it. Okay. And so here come the liberators, as breathing a sigh of relief, because that was their only cannonball, which kind of, kind of astonished the defenders of the fort. And as they approached, they flew a Mexican flag. This is quite common in Latin America because the national flags are symbols of independence from Spain. They're very dear to them. So on the left, they flew the Mexican flag. Well, if you're both flying the same flag, it's kind of hard to distinguish. So they did the same thing the Confederates did, and they have their own distinctive flag, and that's our star flag. Okay, they flew it as a battle jacket. It's like Zapatistas. They ride up. They're flying Mexican flag on the left. They're flying their own battle jacket, the EZLN flag, on the right, to distinguish themselves from the opposite side, you see, and also to send a loud and clear message that don't even think about, U.S. don't even think about annexing us, because if you try, you will be attacking Mexico, okay, and you'll be involved in a U.S.-Mexican war. And as a matter of fact, there was a kind of a jump the gun situation, which there was a landing. They thought that war had commenced between the U.S. and Mexico. Turns out no such things. As they immediately went back on their ship and sailed out. So, oops, our bad. So it worked for a time. It worked for 10 years. And during that 10 years, California was as independent of the Mexican central government as Taiwan is from China today. Okay, we'd achieved that. We did that. And we were the ones that defended California, not the Mexican central government. So here it was not a Mexican-U.S. war. It was a California-U.S. war, okay, which resulted in a ceasefire, which became a recognized armistice, like what ended the Korean War, okay, another divided country. So that is where the star flag came from, right? Then in 1846, there were a number of colonies of U.S. settlers, and they began to fly their flags, which quoted the star flag, but weren't limited to it. The U.S. state flag. Well, that's people who are actually trying to end the independence of California. Same with Sutter. He flew a Mexican tricolor at the center of which was the same star. They're all quoting this flag, right? But they come up with different ones because, again, they don't want to avoid confusion. And they're not flying no Mexican flags whatsoever, even though Sutter's background was of a Mexican tricolor. So they rise up not to, in the form of a Declaration of Independence, they actually, excuse me, they end our independence. They start at the beginning of the end. And then you have a generalized U.S.-Mexican war. The Americans come at us, U.S. Military forces from three sides. Fremont heads south. Kearny heads west and gets his butt kicked at San Pasqual. Sloat lands and takes Monterey, at which point the California government, the civilian government was already in L.A. Okay. The military was still commanded by Comandante Castro out of Monterey. So the civilian government moved. The military zone command did not. That's why the capture of Monterey, the forces had to flee. But the Angelino government was still there. And so, again, the U.S. forces began to converge on it. And eventually you had the ceasefire. Well, you have to have two sides to a ceasefire, and the other side was Californios. Okay, it was not the Mexican central government. This is 1847, mind you, a year before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo sold their neighbor's house. Okay, so the bear flag is the flag of those who never constituted an independent government. Okay, they're just about, it's another, coup, and that's all it was. There was no government behind it except the U.S. government. It had nothing to do with independence. Hence our reversion, if you would, to the flag of 1836, the star flag.
And you've often compared Alta and Baja California to West and East Germany.
Yeah, we got a wall between us, or North and South Korea or something like that. Because, again, California as a Spanish colony grew from south to north. Folks in Baja will remind you of this. This is the original California. And then the colonizers kept moving north into Alta. Okay, so our history as a Spanish colony starts there. the division between Alta and Baja originally was purely administrative. There was no border there. What happened was that the Jesuits had started the missions and they got kicked out by the King of Spain, of every place having to do with Spain. And they were replaced by the Franciscans, who established a chain of missions in Baja until they found out that it's not an island, it's a peninsula. Well, at that point, they paused and they have the Dominicans come in and take over the Franciscan missions as caretakers, while the Franciscans continue to move up the Camino Real and establish the chain of Alta California missions. So it grew from south to north. Our history as a colony comes from there. During the Mexican period, most of the activism was in Alta, but Baja was not excluded. And as a matter of fact, it was Santa Anna, no less, the guy who took away our autonomy. He also reunited the Californias, and they stayed reunited until an international border was passed between them. What happened was that, as I had mentioned earlier, the military forces headquartered in Monterey, they fled temporarily to Sonora, and some stayback units were left behind. A call was issued to the Mexican central government, help us get Alta California back. Santa Anna's like, well, we're kind of busy fighting, we're fighting the U.S. ourselves. So, the help never came. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo only took the northern half of California, the one we're in. They didn't take Baja. They've never taken Baja. Although, as in his book, Cuauhtemoc Morgan of the Movement for the Independence of Baja California will point out, there were many attempts and involvements and everything by the U.S. in Baja trying to reunite it as part of the U.S. state, which, no. Instead, what happened was after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, both Alta and Baja were sliced and diced by their respective national governments. Alta, the U.S. Congress wanted it to be more than one state so they could have more than two senators. And they did that. They split Nevada off, right? And they wanted Nevada to extend to the Sierras, but the California legislature at the time, the U.S. California legislature says, nope, you're only going to get as much to Lake Tahoe. You're not going past Tahoe. And they haven't. In Baja, it was sliced into the U.S. Or into the two Mexican states. The first, there was a territory set up. Baja State in the north and Baja Territory in the south, just like Nevada was set up as a territory. Well, what's the purpose of all these non-self-governing territories? To colonize. Okay, to have more settler colonies set up at the expense of the indigenous people. That's the only reason that any of these have been set up to this day. Okay, like the Northern Territory of Australia, like the Northern Territories of Canada, etc. They're set up as to encourage settler colonialism. Okay, that's the reason they're set up that way. And that's what we were originally. Again, when the U.S. and Mexican states of Alta and Baja were set up, they also had territories sliced from them. It became the U.S. state of Nevada and the Mexican state of Baja Sur. Okay. So they're busy slicing and dicing us, the purpose of which was to get more and more settlers in, okay, at the expense of the indigenous people.
Now, you're in touch with the independence movement in Baja California. And again, this is something that I had no idea before I started talking to people, that this was even something that was being talked about or going on. There's almost a complete blackout on it in the media. Can you talk a little bit about who this organization is, the MIBC? I know you know several of the people involved, and what's going on with that movement down there, and the coordination with the Calics in United States.
Well, they actually go back the 21st century MIBC, which is originally the Partido Peninsular, and then reorganizes, from a single party to a movement to try to draw people from other parties in. MIBC goes back further than we do because the problems, the political problems they address are older than, what happened in 2016, right? They've dealt with that level of corruption for a long, long time. And so MIBC was going pretty strong, is going pretty strong. As a matter of fact, it had the support and has the support of 4 million of the majority of 4 million Baja Californians. They have their own media, and it is widely read and watched. Okay, so they have their own media, California Hoy, etc. And they have been thinking about reunification for a long time, but that would mean becoming the part of the U.S. state, and that's not what they had in mind. They had independence from the Mexican mainland in mind from the get, not another overarching federal government. So they've been fighting the fight for longer than we have. They managed to get a majority. Now, there's 1/10 of as many people in Baja as there are in Alta. Okay. 40 million of us, as many as there are Canadians in Alta. There's 4 million in Baja, which is a desert after all. And it took them forever for the federal government to build a highway, okay, linking the entire peninsula. And it's there now, a little too later with a bunch of potholes and everything like that. And it now belongs to the two state governments. And so they each take out of their budget. Highway 1 has to compete with all the other highways in Baja Norte, but Baja Sur is pretty much smooth sailing. But be that as it may, they've been fighting the same corruption that every other Mexican's been fighting, right? But they do have this physical separation, and they do have a common California history. After all, that's where California began as a Spanish colony, was in the peninsula. They used to call it Baja California. So they've been fighting for a long time. They have achieved majority support in the Baja Peninsula, and then came the election of 2018, in which longtime presidential candidate Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador finally won. Okay, in order to win in that corrupt system, he had to win overwhelmingly, and he did. Not only that, but his Morena party became the governing party in the Mexican Congress, and hey, there's a change there. And pretty quickly, that was followed by the election of a Morenista governor of Baja Norte. Baja Sur is still in the hands of a governor of PAN, okay, which was a long time opposition to the ruling party that was quite strong and still is quite strong in the Baja Peninsula. But no, they've been fighting for longer than we have. Here comes AMLO making all kinds of grandiose promises of a fourth transformation and how he's going to end corruption and blah, 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 blah. And that's that was his basis of his support. And he did do a lot of things. He certainly is more communicative than any recent Mexican president, very communicative. But he also is pushing forward projects he inherited from the previous Mexican governments. Big one is the Tren Maya, to put a railway across the isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's a long-term project he inherited, and he tried to convince people that this is going to be a Maya train that benefits the Maya people. They never asked for a train through there. They never asked for a railway. They were never consulted about it. The Tren Maya is something the Maya never asked for. It's an old project that goes right through their territory. And AMLO supposedly did a consultant and asked them permission that was so corrupt. This is a guy whose career was, and I watched him, his career was built on fighting corruption. Yet the consultant was so corrupt, a Mexican judge threw it out as corrupt, coming from AMLO. Okay. So they see this fourth transformation. They're like, what fourth transformation? What fourth transformation are we talking about? That's on the one hand of what the Mexican federal government is up to. On the other hand, since 2016, they see that there is now suddenly a renewed interest in independence here in Alta, and they got a hold of us. And in effect, they says, if you manage to liberate Alta from the U.S., take us with you. We're having the same problems with our federal government. And we're like, well, if you manage to liberate Baja before we liberate Alta. Take us with you. Okay. And so it goes along. Now in the arsenal of the media of the both independence movement is that lovely promotional video that I put together with the folks in MIBC. November of 2019, I went down with one of these flags, and it was accepted as a national flag by NMIBC, a common national flag. And so they consider themselves a part of our movement in the other part of California. Okay. And that's what they want us to do, is accept them as a part of the movement in Baja, so that, you know, when we liberate ourselves from these two federal governments, immediately we can reunify the country. As a matter of fact, if you look at the promotional video, their prediction, their model of reunifying the country is the same as the model for breaking up the Soviet Union, where you have the chief executives of the four largest Soviet republics signing a Commonwealth treaty that replaced the Constitution of the USSR, right? Well, in our case, what they're predicting is that the three governors of Alta, Baja Norte, Baja Sur, they get together and they sign an instrument jointly declaring the independence and reunification of the Californias. Okay, then you would have the task of reconciling our three constitutions. You'd have to have a constitutional convention, a convention of the Californias, because they're so different, because they were enacted within two different federal republics. So there'd be a lot of work to do for that convention. But they consider themselves to be a part of our movement applied to the other half of California, the half that was never taken from Mexico. Also, right in the middle of that, right on the border, is an indigenous nation, the Kumeyaay. Okay, that border is an international border sliced right through their territory. They're not too happy about it. Met with them in San Diego, and also met with them in Tecate. So I met with both groups of Kumeyaay, and they're very, they would love for the Californians to be reunified, because that means their country is reunified. So there's a lot of parallel things going on that have quite exciting prospects, I think.
Yeah, I was really struck when I heard some of the MIBC folks talking, just how a lot of the struggles and a lot of the issues that they were talking about sounded super familiar to what we seem to be going through.
Yeah.
Kind of a geographic separation from the rest of the country, kind of not feeling culturally connected, dealing with kind of a very remote federal government that is not representative, feeling left out of things, and just dealing with the corruption. And so just a lot of similar issues that I saw when they were talking.
Yeah, it's an old lament. Okay, it's an old lament that has been the case ever since the days of the Spaniards, right? And we had hopes when we heard, that there was this new country called Mexico. And by the way, we first became part of that under Emperor Iturbide in 1821. Then we get the news in 1824 that he's been overthrown. A federal republic has been established. Oh, good. We get to be a state like a U.S. state, which is what they were doing, but they didn't do it for us. And next thing you know, we hear, well, Central America has been granted its independence. And we're like, what about us? We are more geographically separated. And then the next thing we hear that, well, the ruling class in Chiapas doesn't like being out of Mexico. So they retro-seceded from Guatemala. It was like West Virginia, and rejoined the Mexican Federation as a Mexican state of Chiapas. And so we're like, what the, So it was a very turbulent and confusing time. We were as remote from that federal government as we were from the Americans, who were already coming over in droves and expressing an interest But then you get to after we were conquered by the U.S. This is a really sad chapter in California's history. They didn't want to keep the capital in LA because it's a Californio town full of Californios, right? The Anglos wanted to run it for themselves. So they removed the capital in San Jose. Too many Californios. It's a California town. So they moved it to this little tiny place up in the East Bay someplace. I've seen it. I can't even remember the name, but it's a tiny little place. So they temporarily headquartered there. And then the gold rush came. The whole world wanted to go mine gold, right? So the only problem was the gold fields were already spoken for. Of course they were. It's all indigenous land. So they moved the capital again to Sacramento, which was accessible to the gold fields and also the headquarters of the attempted genocide against the Native Americans. This is when, our native California, our indigenous Californians had a price of $5 a scalp on their head, forcing many of them to flee for their lives. There's a place up in Hollister called Indian Canyon, which the genociders didn't find, which is a good thing because they were able to give sanctuary to indigenous people from around California. Okay, they have a deep place of honor in our history as having successfully resisted the genocide attempt until finally, it ceased and people were able to begin to return home. Okay, same thing happened. And of course, as this was going on, there was the run up to the Civil War, then the Civil War, then the post-Civil War, and all that sort of thing going on with the U.S. at the same time. So the Civil War actually kind of slowed down the genocide because the settlers are busy killing each other. Okay, as long as they're having at one another, they got no time for genocide against indigenous people. But the instant that the Civil War was done, they started at it again. Okay, I come from San Bernardino, which just barely beat out Belleville up in Oakland Valley, a mining town, as the county seat. And then when the Civil War came, the Bellevillians came in from the south and they were sending gold back to Confederacy. So we had Civil War battles and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, the war took its course. The Confederates lost, the Union won. And immediately there was a massacre of the people of the Pines, the Yubiatam. So again, it was about securing the gold fields. So the gold rush was a blood rush for our indigenous people. And the foundations of Sacramento are built on a ton of indigenous blood, trust me.
And that is why this Return California, returning federal lands back to the indigenous, is such an important integral part of the independence movement.
Yeah. I mean, how authentic can our independence be unless they, achieve it alongside us? Okay. It's always been warp and woof of our independence movement has been, the return of land and sovereignty. Always, always, always in our history. When you look at, for example, what happened in early Soviet history, right? You had the Russian Empire, which is known as the Prison House of Nations. 1924, they returned 1/3 of Russian territory to those from whom it had been stolen, and that's why you got a Soviet Union to break up. Okay, there would have been no USSR unless 1/3 of Russian territory was returned. And there was still a lot of controversy as to how much, because some were like really tiny, like ours, right? So what we're looking at is that when we achieve independence, all that federal land is available to be returned. Okay, that's roughly half of California. And then the other thing, what they did in the Soviet case was they broke up the legislature into a Soviet of the Union, which is like the lower house, and the Soviet of the nationalities, where the various nationalities are represented. So we can do the same thing with a California Indigenous Congress. As a matter of fact, our Mexican sisters have shown us the way with their own Congreso Nacional Indígena. Okay, they have a National Indigenous Congress there. It's the first civilian authority the Zapatistas have ever recognized. They've actually recognized that as a civilian authority whose orders they'll obey. First time that's happened, after several attempts, by the way. But no, we can do the same thing. We can have a California Indigenous Congress as an indigenous branch of our government. Okay, and it can help us solve problems like the homeless situation, because of course, them campers are camping on indigenous land and being kept from vacant housing by people who bought stolen land, are keeping them from, going into that housing. So there's a lot of Gordian knots that can be cut by ensuring that the indigenous people of California are integral to our independence and reunification.
So we've talked a lot about the history, kind of the meaning behind the movement, indigenous issues, the Baja California. I think this is a good time to take a short break. And in the second part, I kind of want to bring it more into the present day and talk about kind of what's going on currently, right now, between California and America, and how you perceive it and where you think we are as a movement, and what we need to be doing and what we need to be messaging. So that'll be in the second half.
Okay, perfect.